he's going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is good, too. Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and I'll be one of your hosts today. I'll be joined to wrap up our Karluk series by Jess. Once again, Taylor's going to be out again. He has another good excuse that we will get to in good time. Before we get into it, one new patron to thank. So big patron shout out to David. Thanks for signing up on Patreon. We hope you like what you find over there. So let's get into it. Welcome back, Jess, for the fourth time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me back. It's always fun to be here, and I am excited to tell the conclusion to the story.
Some podcasts record their series all in like one big session with a little fake break between them that is just about 10 minutes for the podcasters, but is a week for the listeners. We don't do that. We do real weeks between recording sessions. So welcome back after a real week break. What have you been doing in that time?
Oh, what have I been doing? It has been an odd week. We bought a car, which was stressful. My husband's car finally died, and we've known that was coming for a while, but we didn't expect it to happen quite this soon. So we bought a car. So that took up a lot of my mental energy, because even though we had a pretty good idea of what we wanted, just the mental strain of having to deal with a car dealership was a lot. But other than that, I did get some media time in. I finished Saturday night at the Lakeside Supper Club, which was our library book club read, and it was fine. It was fine. I started something new, though, that I'm pretty excited about. I started the Antarctic Journals of Reginald Skelton, and this was a recommendation from a friend. Shout out to Emma. And she used to be a ship's crew on the RSS Discovery, which is the ship that was Robert Falcon Scott's first expedition to Antarctica. That was the scientific ship that they took to Antarctica, and you can still visit it in Dundee, Scotland. And I had the opportunity to do that last year, which was super cool. So I'm trying to become a little bit more knowledgeable about the Discovery expedition, and having a friend who had worked on the ship was very helpful. But I've heard that Reg Skelton is a fun guy, and kind of snarky, kind of funny, kind of a complainer, which those always make the best journals. If you enjoy reading journals like I do, guys with a little bit of personality always have the best journals. So looking forward to that one.
Also, his name kind of sounds like Red Skelton, like the old-timey entertainer, which is a point in his favor. I'm always amazed, and I think kind of like ships and shipwrecks in general, when I started doing this podcast with Taylor, I had never really read anything about ships or shipwrecks. And I thought maybe there's like 10, 15 interesting shipwrecks that we could make episodes about. And I'm like constantly feeling something similar with Arctic and Antarctic expeditions. I kind of went into it feeling like, oh, there's like 5 or 6 expeditions, but like you keep digging deeper and deeper, and all of these people have little, branches off of this expedition, and there's always new pieces of writing about these things. I'm just fascinated how much there is. It's a huge world.
There is so much, and it's a very kind of incestuous world. A lot of these guys show up on the same expeditions over and over again. And so you'll have guys that serve together on one expedition who will meet up with a different group of guys who maybe serve together on a different expedition. So it's really a very small group of people who are just sort of spread out over multiple expeditions over multiple years. So that's how you get somebody like Tom Crean, who was with Shackleton, who was also with Scott, and who, had a career that spanned many years and many different expeditions. So it's interesting just to learn about not just how many different expeditions there were, but how many of them consisted of the same core group of guys.
In micro form here, I thought that was an interesting part of building the crew of the Karluk. You have those veterans from Shackleton's expedition, and they kind of form a separate voting block almost with the crew. So Taylor, as we mentioned, is out. Again, he is sitting out the even episodes of this series, and He has another good reason. It is Darcy. It is his wife's birthday. So everyone wish Darcy a happy birthday, possibly belated.
Happy birthday, Darcy.
Depending on when you listen to this. We will hopefully get Taylor back for the bonus, which we will tease at the end of this episode. Let's see, what have I gotten into? I'm mostly reading the same books that I've mentioned the last 2 times, but I did start a new one, kind of on accident. I started a book called Kaigun, Strategy, Tactics, and Technology in the Imperial Japanese Navy, 1887 to 1941. That is a book that I got primarily as a reference, because Taylor and I have been going fairly heavy on World War II recently, particularly in our bonus series we just started on the naval battles off of Guadalcanal. There are 7 of them that we have to talk about. I didn't really intend to read Kaigun cover to cover, but I kind of just sat down with it and I was like, oh, this is actually really interesting. So I'm reading that now. A prime example of something I never would have read before we started this podcast. Not something that would have grabbed my attention at all, but here we are, 5-ish years later.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the first episode that you guys did of that series. And I loved the shout out to the HBO miniseries, The Pacific, which is my favorite piece of World War II media and one that I don't think gets nearly enough attention. So this, I know you guys did that bonus episode on the Guadalcanal battles. And I know that Lions Led by Donkeys did a bonus episode recently about kind of the Pacific theater battles. And so with all of this Pacific related media, I'm going to have to rewatch the Pacific. So
yeah, Taylor and I have talked about that a few times. I don't know if it's ever been recorded, but we've kind of talked about how the Pacific, when it came out, we watched it and it didn't grab us because we were fairly young when it came out. And
yeah,
it's not structured exactly like Band of Brothers was. You know, Band of Brothers is almost wall-to-wall action. Whereas the Pacific, you kind of get a bit more of the downtime-ish type parts. There's a bit more of the love story angle also in the Pacific, which didn't quite appeal to us as much. But yeah, having rewatched that fairly recently with Katie, it's so good. And it's so much better than Band of Brothers.
Yeah. And I mean, I enjoy Band of Brothers, but it's more of just a sort of a feel-good, emotional kind of connection to a show, whereas the Pacific is like, wow, this is a great show. This is fantastically acted, fantastically directed. Everything about it is just really exceptional.
Yeah, for sure. Watch the Pacific for your Pacific War media, not the Josh Hartnett film Pearl Harbor.
Please.
Okay, so with that, we are checked in with our media. So this is part 4 of a series. Not going to do a full recap, but please, if you're hearing this, go back and listen to parts 1, 2, and 3. If you have not, what is wrong with you? Why would you do this to yourself?
Why are you here?
How did you get this? So we ended part 3. Bartlett and Kadektovic had managed to reach Emmatown with considerable assistance from local Chukchi and a few well-placed Russians. At Emmatown, they would find this Mr. Karayev, the brother of one of those Russians, who is hopefully going to hook them up with transportation back to Alaska. More urgently, though, Bartlett needs to get somewhere that he can wire a message back to the Canadian government and update them on the expedition's situation. I think throughout this, reading about this in book form, where everything comes to you in a fairly steady flow of information, I think it is hard to reframe this and remember that outside of the Karluk's party, no one knows what has happened to these people at all, and they assume they're dead.
Yeah, it's a mystery. And because Steph has done nothing to raise the alarm about the fact that these people are missing and that they might be in danger. So as far as anybody is concerned, the ship sank, they're all dead, end of story.
I think in part 1, you talked a bit about Stefansson's reputation and how it's overwhelmingly negative and how there's a lot of very valid reasons for that and how he doesn't really do himself any favors. Like in times where it could be a toss-up, his behavior, his attitude just doesn't... I mean, he makes it back and people are like, hey, what happened to your other people? And he's like, they're probably dead out there. Can I have another ship and let's go back?
But more importantly, they might be dead, but here's what we're going to do now. We're going back up north and we're going to continue the work.
he certainly doesn't mourn them.
No.
So Bartlett's trying to get somewhere he can send this message. The closest place to do this would be the settlement at Anadir. I assume in English we would probably pronounce this Anadir, if we say this at all. So this is the first place that Bartlett wanted to get to once he was sufficiently rested and recovered from his journey. But a few days later, there's a new arrival at Emmatown, and this leads to a little change of plans. Now, this is a guy named Baron Kleist, supervisor of northeastern Siberia, who had heard of Bartlett's situation and hoped to track him down to offer assistance. So I was curious about this guy. Meeting a baron out in the wilderness is always kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to read anything I could about him. And unless you have any secret information...
I do not.
I wasn't able to find a lot. Because I was curious, that's not a traditional Russian-sounding name, but at the same time, it's very common especially in the late Russian Empire, for these Prussian families to enter service in Russia, and they end up sort of becoming Russian nobility. I assumed that was the case here, and I was able to find a little write-up of the von Kleist family. It's mostly about the German branch, but it does mention in here that at some point in the 1700s, one of the von Kleists entered Russian service, and the main branch of the family just didn't know about this for 200 years. All of a sudden, late Imperial Russia, there's this Kleist family that sort of becomes more or less known, and it's oh yeah, there's more of us over there. So I couldn't find anything about him specifically. I couldn't even find his first name. But I did get a little bit of reading in about this East Prussian gentry that enters into Russian service. So he's one of them. Don't know which one. So Kleist invites Bartlett to go with him to Emma Harbor. So this is different than Emma Town. And this would be faster than going to Anadir. And so we're gonna pause the Bartlett sector for a little bit. We'll check back in later. For now, we need to get back to Wrangel Island, where the remainder of the Karluk's survivors await rescue. The trio of Maimon, Malak, and Templeman are camped at Rogers Harbor. So this is on the south side of the island.
Yes.
We mentioned that they're trying to break up into some smaller camps to sort of spread out and hopefully survive more effectively that way. So by the end of the first week of May, Maimon's journal starts to really indicate how worn down he is. He's essentially having to care for these other two men on his own, in addition to keeping himself alive. And something we've mentioned before, but Malak becomes a particular challenge here because he's just not doing well, seemingly physically or mentally. On this topic, quoting here from the Ice Master.
Malak was still careless with his feet. Just as they were beginning to improve, he would get them frozen again. He was in a kind of delirium now. He seemed helpless and unable to look after himself, but remained blissfully ignorant of the harm he was doing to his body. Maimon would find him outside in his stocking feet, wandering through the snow, a smile on his face.
Yeah, I think this sort of highlights the problem here with Malak, in that this is dangerous for everyone, but especially if you're not even trying to take care of yourself.
And poor Maimon was in this position where he's, of course, trying to keep himself alive. And remember, Maimon has this swelling sickness. He has swollen legs. He's got the mysterious illness. He's not feeling well. And he is taking care of Malak, who is completely unable to care for himself, not just in the sense that he's wandering outside without shoes and not caring for his body, but he's not able to feed himself. He's not able to go outside the tent to use the restroom. So Maimon is having to clean up after him and just do everything. It's like caring for a child. So he's having to do all of this for Malak, and Templeman is not as bad, but he's not great either. So Maimon is definitely doing the bulk of the caring work for both of these people. And it is really, really wearing him down, because not only is he doing all of this care work, he's also suffering from illness himself. His knee is broken. He is physically exhausted, just one thing after another. He is so just ground down to nothing by this point.
So on May 17th, Malek's condition declined further, with the geologist now unable to move or even really respond to Mayman or Templeman. They spend that morning watching over him in shifts, and then finally at around 5:30 that evening, their watch comes to an end as George Malek breathes his last. Quoting here from Mayman's journal,
"I don't know how this will end. Is it death for all of us? No, with God's help we will get out of it. I am still weak, but as long as there is life, there is hope. There is something that still keeps me alive, all my beloved ones, and with God's help, I hope to be at home, hale and hearty, and spend Christmas with them. It is 2 months today since Captain Bartlett left Icy Spit. I hope to see him again in 2 months now, at the latest."
something I don't think has come up before, but he refers to Icy Spit in that quote, and that's just the first location where they camp on Wrangel, correct?
Yeah, it's one of many different campsites that they've used. So a little bit more about Mayman that I don't think we've been able to get into before is that Mayman was engaged. He had a fiancée by the name of Ellen back at home in Christiana, which is now the town of Oslo. Also, Mayman, in just the perfect kind of emo kid fact about Mayman, his father was the top funeral director in Christiana, which I think kind of explains a lot about Mayman's personality. But also, he would not, with his father being a funeral director, he would not have been unfamiliar with death. And so, seeing Malek die certainly would be difficult for anyone. But I think that, Mayman was able to possibly keep it together a little better than somebody who hadn't had that life experience that he had growing up.
So, like, if anyone on the expedition is going to be okay spending the night in a tent with a dead body, it's probably Mayman.
Yeah. This is something that you do read about multiple times in polar exploration survival situations. It happened with Greeley, and it's happened in some others too. Sometimes if you are in a tent or in a shelter somewhere, you're all huddled up together for warmth, and the person next to you passes away. What do? Do you get up in the middle of the night and try to bury them? Do you put their body out of the tent, or do you just lay there and try to get a little bit of sleep and think that you'll deal with it whenever you're able to? So yeah, they spend the night with Malek's body, and they either weren't able or weren't prepared to get him out of the tent at that time.
Yeah, and I imagine there is still something of a nagging at you, even though this is, a very serious survival situation of, I don't want to just throw this guy outside into this blizzard.
Yeah. I imagine there's probably a nagging sense of, what if I'm wrong? What if I come back? Because these guys have been so sick for so long that it's entirely possible that maybe they just thought he was dead. Perhaps he'd wake up. So I understand not wanting to just, okay, he's dead now. Let's get this body out of here.
So this same day, actually, the 17th, McKinley leaves from shore camp at Icy Spit, and he heads for Rogers Harbor. So he arrives, and he learns that Malek had died, and he sees that Mayman is not doing much better. The three decided that they would all return to the north side of the island with the others, but weather delayed their departure, and Mayman actually proves too weak to move, so he can't really make this trip anyway. Not wanting to just leave him behind, so Templeman will end up staying to take care of him, while McKinley goes to retrieve a store of pemmican from Skeleton Island for them. So he's going to go to Skeleton, he's going to come back to these two.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the I think more surreal parts of the story, but McKinley, he ends up wandering all the way back to shore camp.
Yeah.
He misses his exit for Skeleton Island, and he walks all the way back to his main camp. So he covers about 60 miles in a little over 40 hours.
And I think that this shows just how disorienting this environment is, because everything you're looking at is just cold and white. And it's not like there's big trees or anything that you can use as landmarks. The ice is constantly shifting. And so there's, not even anything you can kind of look out on the horizon and say, well, based on, the presence of this glacier or this iceberg, I am here. So you really have no landmarks and nothing to use to try to figure out where you are. So he was very disoriented and also suffering from snow blindness. So he is just sort of doing his best. And instead of getting to where he needed to go with the pemmican, he overshoots his target and ends up all the way back at shore camp.
Yeah, and that really shows the disorientation, not just in space, but also in time. You know, if you're wandering through this, the sun isn't really a factor. Everything looks the same. There's no way to measure how long you've been walking, you know, until you stumble upon something and you realize, oh, I walked all the way back to camp. Monroe and Maurer, they're going to leave on May 26th. They're leaving the main camp for Rogers Harbor, and they're hoping to aid and or retrieve Mayman and Templeman, since McKinley was not able to, get them those supplies. Monroe and Maurer, they do make it to Rogers Harbor, where they find that things have gotten even worse.
Just as they arrived and dropped their gear, Templeman crawled from the tent. He was shaking all over, babbling in a delirium. His terror-filled eyes darted wildly about, and he reached out to touch Monroe and Maurer to make sure they were real, then fell to his knees and wept. Both dead, he told them through fits and cries. Mayman and Malak, both dead. He was alone with the dead men, not knowing if anyone would ever come.
Yeah, like many of these, if McKinley's expecting to be back at a certain time and he doesn't come, you kind of probably expect no one's coming back for you.
This is whenever, in the last episode, I kind of alluded to there being two things that really haunted me, two visuals of this expedition that just really stand out in my mind. And one of them was the Mackay party trudging along towards their imminent death. And the other one is this one, Templeman in this tent with two corpses, thinking that this is it. This is where I'm going to die. And he doesn't even have the strength to get the bodies of his friends out of the tents and bury them. He is just laying there in this tent with their corpses, thinking that I'm going to die here too. I'm going to die here beside them. And that is incredibly haunting.
There is a big difference between I am in this tent with a dead person, but most of the people in this tent are alive, compared to I am the only living person in this tent.
Yeah. We have one living person in this tent and it is me. The rest are dead.
If we held an election in this tent, the vote would be decided in the interests of the dead because there are more of them. That is a scary, very grim idea. That is very horror movie worthy.
It does something to Templeman, and we'll kind of see that as this plays out. But it breaks something in him. He is not the same person that he was before this, and understandably so. But yeah, it was just such a traumatic event to be trapped in a tent on an island alone with nobody else coming for you, thinking, "Here I am. I'm going to die in this tent." So he was definitely not the same man afterward.
Templeman, he relates to the two of them that Mayman had woken up in the early hours of May 26th and asked for a fire for some tea. They have tea. They both nod off back to sleep. But Templeman wakes up not long after, and he attempts to rouse Mayman. After he lets him sleep peacefully a bit longer, Templeman realizes that Mayman has passed. Monroe and Maurer, they're going to go back to shore camp, but Templeman is too weak to walk, and he has to be left there at Rogers Harbor. He just can't catch a break here.
No. And I think it's important to point out, too, that before they left to go back to shore camp, Monroe and Maurer did bury Malak and Mayman. So there were not just corpses in a tent at this point. They were strong enough that they were able to dig a shallow grave for them and to bury them. And they put up a wooden cross as a grave marker. So they did bury their friends. But unfortunately, Templeman still can't go anywhere. So he's still stuck in the tent, not with the corpses anymore, but he is still stuck in the tent alone.
Yeah, now he gets to really, make the decision. Is it better to be with two dead guys, or is it better to just be totally alone here? The decision is made to move the main shore camp from Icy Spit to Cape Waring. Monroe is also going to decide here that he's going to move to Rogers Harbor with Maurer and Templeman. So it'll be back up to 3 down there. And I know this led to some tension because this leaves basically McKinley in charge of everyone else when that's kind of supposed to be Monroe's gig.
It very much is supposed to be Monroe's. And so this is a situation where when you're the boss, when you're the person who's in charge, this is your circus, these are your monkeys. I get that you don't want to deal with all of the chaos and the mess of the camp, but you don't get to just say, I'm just going to go to Rogers Harbor where it's a lot easier. Also, it's important to note, I think that Monroe and Maurer were both 2 of the physically stronger members of the party at this point. So they are taking, their strength and going somewhere else instead of staying to help hunt and contribute and find food for the rest of the party, which was not physically as strong at this point. A lot of them were very sick. McKinley was pretty sick. So most of the people who were there at shore camp were physically not doing very well. So that makes it extra just wild that Monroe said, you know what, I'm just going to leave this with you, McKinley, and I'm just going to take my strong, able body and my strong, able-bodied friend Maurer, and we're just going to go back to Rogers Harbor. Not that living with Templeman, who by this point was, pretty much unable to care for himself, not that that would be a picnic, but they have one very sick person to care for. McKinley had several very sick people to care for.
Yeah, this is a bit like the leaving for Rogers Harbor is a bit like knowing that you're going to have a really crazy day at work, and then your boss Teams messages everyone that morning, say, "Hey, I'm actually going to work from home today, but you guys have fun dealing with that."
Yeah. It's a little like saying, I am going to take a hunting party to go find some caribou now that things are looking like you're going to get real here, and I will see you guys later. He learned from the best. I learned it from you, Steph.
Yeah, who says Steph is not a good leader? Obviously, in this extreme survival situation, people living in close proximity but not having that much stuff to live on, obviously tensions are growing. There's some dissension over rations and supplies. You have people living, kind of at a distance from each other. And, this leads to some morbidly interesting discussions of, when people are going out hunting, are they sharing everything that they caught with the whole group? Are they keeping any of that back from the...
Mm-hmm.
Are they maybe keeping the fattest parts of the seal for themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Did they only catch 10 birds, or did they catch 20 and they're hiding the rest of them from us?
Yeah.
I know questions come up of, I think it's a stew that Auntie has made that one of the tents is using, and like, hey, that's our stew. That's not your stew.
Yeah. There was a lot of this. There was a lot of bickering over food, which I think is very common when you've got people in a survival situation. You'll read about how all they do is think about food. They dream about food. Their every waking thought is consumed by food because they're starving. And so all of these food related squabbles become extremely important. So you've got some of the seamen who are doing some hunting, and everything is supposed to go to Kiruk, to Auntie, so that she can divide everything up evenly. And she is the person who is best equipped to take that food and make it stretch. So she can do things like, if you catch a bird, instead of just dividing up the meat on the bird, she would use the bones and make a soup. She'd use the blood and make a soup. So she was able to take all parts of the animals and everything that they caught and make sure that they stretched it as much as humanly possible. So everything was supposed to go through her, and then it would be allotted out to everyone so that everyone would get the same amount of food. But that's not always what had happened, because if you are, a fairly able-bodied seaman and you go out hunting and you catch 5 crowbills, maybe you only turn 3 of them in, and you and your buddy will just, snarf down those 2 in secret, and nobody will need to know about it. So anything involving food became a very big deal at this point, and there were lots of fights over food. People were not turning in all of their food to be divided up like they were supposed to. It's funny, all of the men at this point reported had nothing but wonderful things to say about the indigenous family after the fact. So they talked about how, we would not have made it without Auntie. She was the glue that held us all together. But they were perfectly willing to steal food from her in the moment. So there was definitely a little bit of kind of looking back on the experience and whitewashing some of the things that they did, making it appear not as bad as it was. But food squabbles were constant. You've got starving people, and they are thinking about food constantly, and any possible slight in their food allocation was a very big deal.
I think also here, I mean, obviously in this situation, you don't have a safe or a room you can lock this stuff in.
No.
So the temptation is certainly there, knowing that, okay, we do have stores and they're in this tent. We saw stuff like that with the Essex, all of them trying to survive on these pretty small whaleboats. And if you're the leader of that boat, you've got to somehow keep guys out of this, tiny little chest or bag, wherever you have the food that's going to keep you alive. And yeah, we saw instances where even in that situation, you have, people stealing or trying to steal food in a situation where you're almost guaranteed to get caught.
Yeah.
So one of the things this leads to is that Karluk, he moves his family off to some cliffs at a distance from camp. There's going to be better bird hunting there.
Yeah, better bird hunting and just a little bit of distance from all of these angry, hungry, crazy men.
Karluk is like Empire of Ice and Stone, more like Empire of Gripes and Moans.
Yeah.
So this leads to my favorite part of the whole story. I dropped the book. I think I dropped Empire of Ice and Stone, or maybe the Ice Master when I got to this part. It's so beautiful, and it shows where's the real MVP in this expedition. So this is regarding a bit of about Karluk's mental state. I think Karluk is in an interesting position here because not only is he part of this expedition, but he's also there with his whole family. And so that kind of adds that extra dimension of he's not just taking care of himself and his expedition mates, but literally his wife and children are there, that he is sort of not entirely separately, but definitely that is a different discrete focus of his.
Sure.
And that's something that kind of comes up occasionally. You're reminded of it in the story. And this, I think, is the best example of that.
Perhaps he should not have let Mugpi know his fear. He was the father, after all, and she was just 4 years old. But she comforted him. They were so much alike, both comical and funny, more lighthearted than Auntie or Helen. Maybe this is why he reached out to her now, when he should have been protecting her. Or maybe it was because he was in a desperate situation, one he had never experienced or dreamed of experiencing, and because he was afraid. "Are you sure we will live?" he asked. "We are living now, aren't we?" said Mugpi.
No, Mugpi.
I know. Challenge, get through this section without crying.
Oh, she's so sweet. But also, that scene, I think, highlights something you'd see in any sort of situation like this, where children are really resilient, and maybe it's partly that children just don't understand how bad or how extreme the situation is, but children are really resilient, managing to stay positive and happy, and even just playing games in these horrific extreme situations.
Yeah.
Again, we could just last episode, you could tie that back to the genocide in Gaza. As bad as it gets, you still occasionally see videos of children smiling and playing and singing songs, and that is really an amazing part of the human spirit. In situations that they shouldn't have to be in, but keeping that sort of spark of humanity alive.
Yeah, and not just for the children, but also for the adults around them, both in this story and in Gaza. You hear about these children who are resilient and living life and still able to find joy in things. And that can inspire the adults around them to say, hey, we have something to live for. We have a reason to keep going. And this is it.
We have that bit of really life advice from Mugpi. And then we kind of transition into one of the darker parts, darker and most mysterious parts of the story.
Yeah.
A lot of it has been somewhat morbid up to this point, but we know more or less what happened to all of the people that we've lost so far. This has a bit more gray area to it. So at one point, I didn't mark down how much time had passed here, but most of the camp is woken up by a gunshot. And I guess it is worth noting that ice makes a lot of crazy sounds too.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's described as popping, or sometimes like an explosion. Sometimes it does sound like a gunshot. But this is very clearly an actual gunshot in very close proximity. So this, of course, rouses the camp. And is it Williamson who's in the tent?
Yeah, so Williamson and Clam are in a tent with George Breddy, who is one of the stokers. So the three of them are in the tent, and everybody around the camp hears a gunshot. And then they hear Williamson yelling, "Help, help, Breddy has shot himself." So everybody comes running, and they see, that Breddy is lying there, and there is a gun in his hand, and there is a bullet wound kind of, I believe, through his eye. So he's shot himself in the head. And so then the question is, well, was this an accident? Was this a suicide? What exactly was going on here? And according to some of the sources that we have, there was also a question of the hand placement, the way that the gun was sitting in Breddy's hand. It didn't quite look the way that they thought that it might look if someone had intentionally shot themselves. So there was then this question of, is it possible that maybe Breddy didn't shoot himself either intentionally or accidentally? Maybe it was murder. And I think that's why it's so important to know how much discord and how much, anger and squabbling there was over food and over everything at this point. These are not happy men. They are not, sometimes suffering will elevate people, and you'll hear stories about how, they banded together and they became the best versions of themselves in the midst of their suffering. That is not the story. These guys, nobody was elevated by their suffering. They were just suffering. They were being the worst versions of themselves. So the question is it possible that one of them could have committed murder? And so some of them, I know specifically McKinley and Hadley, start to kind of look sideways at Williamson, who had been, like most of them at this point, maybe not entirely honest about the food that he had brought in, and had maybe stolen some things that didn't belong to him. And maybe there was some question about, would Breddy have killed himself, or could Williamson and Breddy have had some kind of conflict where Williamson decided to stage a suicide? Also, there were some items that had been stolen from camp, some of McKinley's personal possessions, some food, some other things around camp that had been stolen. All of those items were later found among Breddy's possessions. Now, it's entirely possible that Breddy stole them. I mean, they were all stealing from each other. This was, nobody was perfect here. So it's very possible that Breddy had just stolen the things. But it's also theoretically possible that if Williamson was trying to frame Breddy and trying to take out Breddy, that he would just take all the things that he stole and put them in Breddy's bag and make it look like Breddy was the guilty party. So there is a lot of mystery surrounding this, and it's one of those situations where we will probably never know exactly what happened. My theory is probably an accident. And I know that's the least fun theory to talk about. The one with the least interesting, the least interesting of the three theories. But I think that there's certainly reason to take into account the things that McKinley and Hadley are saying, because of course they were there, but also they were not crime scene investigators, and they do not have any deep knowledge of what a normal position for a gun in your hand after committing suicide is supposed to be. So they don't have true crime documentaries. They don't have court TV or any of those things that we have today where we can think about things in sort of that true crime lens. They're just going based on, hey, I don't think that looks right. But if it were an accident, if he were cleaning his gun and it accidentally went off, it's hard to say what position the gun might end up in your hand. So there are a lot of different possibilities that we could be looking at. And I think that this is probably a case where the least interesting possibility is the most likely thing to have happened. But I also don't necessarily put murder past these guys, just because they were in such a dire situation and they really, really were not getting along. So I don't want to point the finger at them and say, you could have been a murderer, but I certainly think that some of them may have been capable of it.
When writing the TV series, it would definitely be murder, or heavily implied to be murder.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Drama value.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I would agree that most of the time it's usually the boring explanation or the less dramatic explanation that is probably what happened.
Yeah. In McKinley's diary, he had alluded to, questions of, the gun not looking right in his hand and all that. But in his book that he published in the 1970s, it basically just says this was either a suicide or an accident. So he'd kind of abandoned the murder theory by the time he got to writing his actual account. But Hadley had also kind of theoretically pushed the murder theory. But there's a whole other scenario with Hadley's diary. Basically, Hadley's diary was just very the one that we know is Hadley's diary is just very straightforward. He was not a particularly good speller or particularly good writer, so mostly just a series of notes and stuff. But then in his book, I don't remember if it was The Friendly Arctic or The Adventure of Wrangel Island, but one of his, probably The Friendly Arctic, Steph claimed to have come across a copy of Hadley's diary in which Hadley conveniently backs up everything that Steph has ever said about the expedition, and it's written in such a way that it's pretty clear that Jack Hadley, kind of rough and tumble Alaskan sailor man, did not write this. It was definitely written by somebody who slapped Hadley's name on it. So there's all sorts of questions, all sorts of fascinating questions about the veracity of primary sources in this entire expedition, and that's just one of them. So I think that, again, I do think that the accident theory is the most realistic. Not that those guys are not capable of murder, but I don't like to think that they made it that far, and I don't know that the evidence necessarily supports it.
That air quotes Hadley journal, probably like when I get an essay from a student, I teach English learners, and then I get 5 paragraphs of perfect English.
Uh-huh.
It is theoretically possible that you really, 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 really tried and put a lot of effort into this and making it perfect. That is possible, but I don't think that's what happened. I think it's much easier to say that this is probably Google Translate or now ChatGPT.
Yeah. I don't envy anybody who's a teacher right now with ChatGPT.
The drama with the death of Brady is a good sort of jumping point here. We can jump back to what has Bartlett been up to, and this is kind of gonna bring these two threads together eventually. So we're rewinding a little bit to May 10th. So on May 10th, this is 1914, Bartlett had set off with Baron Kleist and their dog teams for Emma Harbor. And so here we actually say goodbye to Kadektovic. He's not going to be continuing on with Bartlett, but the captain did see him off with a nice little gift of the hunting rifle that they'd been using for so much of their survival. So they reached Kleist's home at East Cape on May 16th, having covered 175 miles. And through word of mouth among various locals on their trip, Bartlett is able to learn that there had been a whaling vessel nearby in recent days, and it was under the command of a Captain Peterson, or Pedersen, maybe. And so this ends up being a guy named Theodore Peterson, who already has a connection to the Karluk.
Yeah, Theodore Peterson was the original captain of the Karluk. He was the original person that Stefansson had reached out to and asked him if he would captain the Karluk. And he initially agreed to it, but he eventually parted ways with Steph because of just general disagreements over the entire scope of the expedition, over the condition of the Karluk, over pretty much everything you can imagine disagreeing with Steph about. So they parted ways. And that was when Steph reached out to Bartlett and sent him that telegram, will you come on the Karluk with me as master? And so Peterson was probably the least surprised of anyone to hear that the Karluk had sank.
I just think that's a a hilarious way to re-enter the story.
Yeah.
Of, seeing this, bedraggled captain of the ship that you left because you knew it wasn't safe. It probably feels, in a way, on one level, pretty good. Like, I made the right choice.
Yeah. Validating for sure.
So yeah, he's probably feeling pretty smart about himself here. I think we referred to the fact that Bartlett was not the first captain of the Karluk here. I don't think we mentioned Peterson's name in the first episode. Also, kind of shows how small of a world this is. You're gonna cross paths, kind of like you talked about with the explorers earlier. You're gonna cross paths with the same people.
Mm-hmm.
So on May 19th, the Herman, so this is Peterson's ship, arrived in port at Emma Harbor, and when Bartlett went on board to meet with Peterson, the whaling captain agreed to bring him to Alaska as quickly as possible. On May 24th, they attempted to land at Nome, but ice conditions prevented that landing. With this ice not breaking up, Peterson's next suggestion is to make for St. Michael to the southeast, to get Bartlett to the Army Signal Corps station there to relay his message. So Bartlett is put ashore at St. Michael on the morning of May 28th, and after a few little stags, he's able to get his message out to the Canadian government. There's a pretty humorous scene here where he's at the station, and he needs to send this message, and I believe, is it that he doesn't have enough money?
It is. He does not have enough money. And I have, I'm going to read a little bit from Bartlett's book, The Karluk's Last Voyage. And there's a little paragraph before we get into the text of what he actually sent, where he says, "I traveled a good many 100 miles to reach the spot, and I am afraid that I almost lost my patience with the red tape that could stand in the way of a message that had to be sent." Now, you know, and I know that him almost losing his patience means that he was swearing up a storm and absolutely throwing a fit. Even among Newfoundland whalers, Bob Bartlett was notorious for his filthy mouth and for his very vigorous Newfoundland swearing. So when he says, "I almost lost my patience," I had to laugh a little bit. This is another example of this book being extremely funny, and just Bob Bartlett being extremely funny and just a fascinating character to learn about. Yeah, I almost lost my patience. Meanwhile, like the paint stripped off the walls from the ferocity of his swearing, I am sure.
Being known as like a particularly potty-mouthed Newfoundland sailor, that's like when we talk about someone who was considered racist by his peers in the 1800s, or like when we talk about like a Russian naval officer who has a reputation as an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
If you're standing out from your peers in this situation, that's pretty impressive.
And we do have the text of the message, the exact message that Bartlett sent out.
Yeah. If you have that, could you read us in what words did he send out to the world for the first time to update them on the Karluk's predicament?
Okay. Naval Service, Ottawa, Canada. Karluk ice pressure sank January 11, 60 miles north Herald Island. Preparation made last fall, leaves ship, therefore comfortable on ice. January 21st, sent 1st and 2nd mate, 2 sailors with supporting party, 3 months provisions, Wrangel Island. Supporting party returned, leaving them close Herald Island. They expected land island when ice moved inshore. February 5th, Mackay, Murray, Beaushot, Sailor Morris left us using manpower pull sledges. Sent again Herald Island, 3 sledges, 20 dogs, pemmican, biscuit oil. Open water prevented their landing. Saw no signs men, presumed they gone. Wrangel. Returning left provisions along trail. Shortly after their return, east gale sent us west. February 24th, I left camp. March 12th, landed Monroe, Williamson, Mallock, McKinley, Mayman, Hadley, Chafe, Templeman, Maurer, Breddy, Williams, Eskimo family, Wrangel, 86 days supplies each man. March 17th, Monroe, 2 men, 14 dogs, left for supplies shipwreck camp. Plenty of driftwood game island. March 18th, I left island, Eskimo landed Siberia, 50 miles west Cape North. May 21st, Captain Peterson, whaler Herman, called for me Emma Harbor, going out of his way whaling to do so. Soundings, meteorological observations, dredging kept up continually. Successful. 1,200 fathoms, animal life found bottom. Need funds, pay bills, contracted Siberia and here. Wire Northern Commercial Company, San Francisco, $500. Instruct them forward by wire, St. Michael's. Bartlett, Captain, CGS.
Is CGS the Canadian
Canadian government ship?
Oh, Canadian government ship. Okay.
Yeah, there even to this day there's some debate about whether the Karluk was HMCS or CGS. Is it His Majesty's government or His Majesty's Canadian ship, or is it Canadian government ship? Sometimes you'll see it both ways. I believe on the life preservers on the ship itself it said HMCS, but it could go either way.
I guess I could change the episode titles to HMCS/CGS, but I don't think Buzzsprout will let me make the titles any longer.
I don't think it matters. I think either way, people know what you're talking about.
Well, also, first of all, thank you, Captain Bartlett, for a very convenient summary of the story so far.
Yeah.
In this, that's a nice little recap of everything that happened in a very clear fashion. Yeah, it's amazing to have to tell that whole story just in what you can send on one of these wired messages.
Yeah.
Actually, this would be a great example to use in class for when we talk about content versus function words.
All of the articles and all of the non-essential words are stripped out of that. It is just every word has a purpose in a telegram.
This is actually super useful. I'll definitely mark this down and use it in class.
Yeah. I think I put in the notes like the exact page it is and everything in the in the Bartlett book. So.
Which is really what my class probably needs, is just more of my own interests being injected into it.
No, if I were a teacher, every class would be about my interests. I would find a way to make everything about the things that I'm interested in. So you're in good company.
Yeah, this last term we just happened to be able to talk about shipwrecks and baseball for like half the term.
Crazy.
Bartlett gets his message out finally after wrangling over the price, and finally getting that out. And quoting here from Empire of Ice and Stone about the Canadian government response to receiving this message. The Naval Service Department in Canada responded immediately, expressing relief about the survivors. They had assumed the Karluk lost, and all on board perished, and assuring Captain Bartlett full support in rescue operations. But because of Bartlett's location and relative proximity to Wrangel Island, the Naval Service asked for his advice regarding ships and timing of the operation. He would know, or be able to discover, what ships would be best suited and precisely when ice conditions would permit rescue attempts. That quote really shows how Bartlett, he's done all this hard work, he's finally got his message out, but still his, the expectations of him will continue. He still has quite a bit of work to do in the actual rescue portion. He's still going to be needed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So now his job, he's made his long trek, he's made his journey, he's achieved his goal, but his work is not done yet. So now he has to try to coordinate this rescue effort. And this is not going to be an easy rescue effort. And it's going to require a specific type of ship. You've got to have an icebreaker. You can't just have any old ship trying to rescue people in Wrangel Island. And so all of this knowledge of Bartlett's career, all of his accumulated ice knowledge and, experience on whalers and sealers is kind of coming into play now while he plans this rescue. This is his moment. This is his big moment. So he's got to take everything he's learned in his life up to this point and apply it now.
This part of the story of him getting through the tough survival part and then still having a little bit more to do, it gave me the same feeling as at the end of The Lord of the Rings, when the hobbits get back to the Shire. And unlike in the movies where that's the end of all of the stress and the strife, no, they get back to the Shire and then, Saruman and his thugs have taken over the Shire and they have to fight a whole battle. And you don't get that if you just watch the movies. This is this part of the story for Bartlett. So Bartlett is making inquiries about ships that might be available for a rescue attempt, and several come to his attention. Two of these are Russian icebreakers, the Taimyr and the Vilhjalmur. They might be able to help from their station at Vladivostok. Just as a bit of minutia, I was curious what these names were for, and Taimyr is named for the Taimyr Peninsula, and Vilhjalmur is named for an island, kind of in that same area. So there was a third Russian icebreaker being repaired, but she might not be ready immediately. She could be ready in a couple of months. I think Nadezhny was her name. And then there's the U.S. revenue cutter Bear. So in the notes I wrote connection to Greeley expedition, and I kind of remember what this was.
Yeah. The U.S. revenue cutter Bear shows up in a lot of these stories. The Bear is one of the few ships that's kind of up there in the Arctic. So whenever there's a crisis in the Arctic, the Bear tends to be on the scene pretty quickly because there just aren't that many ships that are capable of being in the Arctic. So the Bear played an important role in the Greely expedition. She rescued the survivors of the Greely expedition. So it was not an easy rescue. So the Bear has already played a role in one of these great Arctic survival stories. So it makes sense that she would go on to play a role in another great Arctic survival story.
Actually, one of my upcoming reads is another one from Buddy Levy, his Labyrinth of Ice. So I can learn a bit more about the Greely expedition.
Greely is such a good story. It is, it's set quite a bit earlier than the Karluk and kind of a different set of circumstances. It is, a military expedition, but a lot of the same beats, a lot of the same problems, and a lot of similar outcomes. And I really enjoy Buddy Levy as a writer, too. So I think you'll really like that one.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into that one once I've boxed up and put away this story from my head. I will get into the Greely expedition. Bear had actually been trying to deliver mail at Nome, but ran into those same ice problems that the Herman had, and so she put in at St. Michael as well. Her captain, Captain Cochrane, expressed enthusiasm to help with the rescue, but he needed an official change to his orders before doing so. He can't just go off and do this because he wants to. So she would actually continue on her scheduled routes, but Bartlett was able to convince Cochrane to let him stay on board, hoping that this permission would come and they could undertake this rescue. So it was July 13th when Bartlett came aboard the Bear, where he was kind of treated as kind of a visiting member of the crew. He sleeps in the captain's cabin. He has access to the chart room.
Mm-hmm.
And around this time, though, those two Russian icebreakers, Taimyr and Vygach, they're attempting to reach Wrangel Island, and they actually get really close.
They get so close. Ugh.
They get within 10 miles of this, and physically, they probably could have made it. It seems like that was a possibility here. But this is early August 1914. As the Karluk survivors are struggling to survive on Wrangel Island, there is another struggle that is popping off elsewhere in the world, specifically on the Belgian-German border, where the German invasion of neutral Belgium has triggered a declaration of war by Great Britain under the Treaty of London, and the Great War is on. That is going to affect the deployment of these two Russian icebreakers. So with Russia being pulled into the war as well, those Russian vessels are going to get called back to port, back to Vladivostok to await their wartime orders. So they're so close, but they can't quite get there, and they have to leave the scene.
Yeah. To
do, ultimately, I assume not very much in the war, being in the Russian Far East.
Yeah.
So also in early August, Captain Cochrane receives official permission to go to Wrangel Island. The Herman under Captain Peterson continued on her route to Herschel Island, and this is actually where members of the Southern Party finally get an update on what happened to the rest of their boys.
Yeah, they had no idea. And what's really funny about this is we think of the Karluk and the Northern Party as being such a disaster. The Southern Party was just doing their thing. That was a very successful part of the Canadian Arctic expedition. They did the things that they were supposed to do. They achieved their goals. They were a fully functioning, well-oiled machine of an expedition. And then you have this absolute disaster that is happening with the Karluk with their counterpoints. So the last they heard was when Steph had come up and said, like, hey, we don't know what happened to the Karluk. They might be dead. We don't know. So they probably also believed that their shipmates were either dead or lost to them. And so hearing that there were survivors was pretty exciting. And I believe that is how they got hooked back up with Burt McConnell, who I think had been part of the Southern Party after he went with Steph. Whenever Steph went and kind of barged in and interjected himself into the Southern Party and took a bunch of their supplies. I believe that McConnell stayed with the Southern Party. I would have to double check myself on that. But at any rate, McConnell is at this point reunited with Bartlett and with learning what had happened to the Karluk since he set off. So at this point, McConnell is kind of back in this story. And it's funny because we don't we think of him as just, no, this is Steph's secretary that left the ship when he did. He's probably the guy I would least expect to get back involved in this story. So he's sort of an odd addition.
I felt that way too, because he seems like the type who could just most easily melt back into whatever other job he wanted to do.
Yeah.
He's a young guy. It's not like he's a career Arctic guy. He seems like he could just kind of slip off into the ether. And it is kind of surprising. He stays fairly plugged into the story, and he's kind of the one who's involved in these final stages with the rescue.
And I'll get into a little bit of what McConnell does at after the expedition at the end, but this definitely altered the course of his life and kind of melted his brain in some ways, I think.
So some additional rescue ships that get involved here. One of them is the SS Corwin, and an interesting little fact about her: she's actually at this point the most recent ship to actually land at Wrangel Island. And that was in the process of searching for signs of survivors from USS Jenness, the aforementioned Jenness.
This expedition continues to be haunted by the Jenness in a lot of interesting ways.
So there's the Corwin, and there's also a ship called the, I assume it's pronounced King and Wing.
I've heard King and Wing. I've also heard King and Vinga. I have no idea which one is correct. This is the result of having only read about things and not heard the words pronounced. So I am unsure which is correct.
Since it rhymes in English, I'll say King and Wing. King
and Wing is good.
And this is under Captain Joachimson. There's another guy that's not Joachimson. What's the other?
Svensson?
Svensson, yes. Or Norwegian or Swedish. I forget which one he is.
I'm not sure.
They're all basically the same.
Whatever. It's close enough.
So we have those two ships who are getting involved here as well. So on September 7th, the King and Wing pushed to within 2 miles of Wrangel Island. Quoting here from Empire of Ice and Stone.
Captain Joachimson shouted to the lookout in the crow's nest, who yelled back that he saw something on the beach. Captain Joachimson and McConnell each scoured the shoreline with binoculars. It was blanketed with a recent dusting of snow. Then McConnell saw the scene clearly and confirmed it with the captain. We could only see a dilapidated 4-man tent, a flagpole, and a cross. Captain Joachimson blew the ship's whistle, the high-pitched wail piercing the sharp Arctic air, and they watched and waited anxiously for any signs of movement, any signs of life.
They continue laying on these ships' whistle. This is, very clearly a place that people have been, and they see the figure of a man crawl out of the tent. And he's not yelling, he's not shouting, he's not running around. They know he's looking at them. They know that he sees them in theory, but he's not reacting like your classic, lost on an island waving to get people's attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this guy that they saw was actually Monroe. So this was John Monroe, who was the chief engineer, who had crawled out of this tent. The story goes, I've read some of the first-person accounts from Maurer and Monroe that Maurer actually heard the ship's whistle first, and they were very close to death. They were probably delirious. They went to Rogers Harbor in the hope of finding better hunting and better game, and they really didn't have any luck. So they were eating, they were lucky if they found a bird. They were eating, bird eggs in various stages of development. They were eating rotten, meat off bones. They were starving. They were eating anything they could find. So they're laying in the tent, just sort of waiting to die. And as they're laying in the tent waiting to die, every time they exit the tent, they see the cross and they see the graves of their friends, and they think, okay, this is where it's going to end for us too. So of the three, Maurer and Monroe were a little more aware than Templeman. Templeman, something broke in Templeman, being left alone with the bodies of his friends, and then being left alone all that time while he waited for Monroe and Maurer to come. Another thing about Templeman is he was one of the crew who had struggled with addiction. So he is presumably withdrawing from whatever he had been on, and is also having this incredibly traumatic experience happening to him. So he was very shut down. But they're laying in the tent, waiting to die, and Maurer hears something, and is that a ship's whistle? So Monroe kind of crawls out very slowly because, again, they're dying. They're not in good physical shape. And he hears this whistle. And so he crawls out of the tent and he kind of makes his way very slowly toward where he hears the sound coming from. And, kind of rubs his hand across his eyes. Am I seeing this? Am I hallucinating? Is this something that's really happening? And sure enough, at this point, I think McConnell, through the binoculars, is able to identify that this is Monroe, the chief engineer. So these three guys are rescued.
Yeah, the whole it's got to seem like it's a mirage. You probably start wondering, did Mayman see a rescue ship right before the end? Also, did Malik see this also right before the end? From the ship, Svensson, McConnell, and some of the crew they go ashore by Umiak and they approach this tent. With some difficulty, McConnell is able to identify who these three are. As Jess mentioned, Monroe, Maurer, and Templeman. This is the Rogers Harbor camp that they've found. And they're informed that there are 12 people left of the expedition total.
And I don't know if you got a chance to watch the rescue footage that I sent over, but
I did click through it. I didn't watch it from start to finish, but yes, I did click through some of it.
Yeah, well, there's only like the last 8 minutes are actual rescue footage. The rest of it is just, random scenes in Alaska, which is interesting, but not what anybody's here for. But whenever you see these three men, like there is no life in these eyes. The only one who looks like he's even got a tiny bit of life left in his eyes is Monroe. Maurer and Templeman are both just, they look like zombies. And so I can understand how if you are Burt McConnell and you are looking down and looking at these guys, like I kind of recognize them, but I can't believe that these are the guys because these were all, fairly big, strong, sturdy guys. And they lost like 40, 50 pounds. They're wrapped in rags. They're overgrown, scraggly beards. They look like shambling corpses. And eventually they did figure out who they were and they got them onto the King and Ving. And once they get on the ship, they said to the captain, there is something that we have been thinking about nonstop laying in the tent, and that is sweetened condensed milk. So they begged the captain, could we please just have a can of sweetened condensed milk? And they said, oh, we want to give you a whole meal. We want to clean you up and give you everything, all the food that you could dream of. But they said, no, please, just a can of sweetened condensed milk right now. And they sat there and they each got their own can of sweetened condensed milk and they just ate it with a spoon. And they write about how that was just about the happiest that they'd been in a very long time. So it's funny how the things that you would think of when you're laying in a tent starving to death, I certainly would be thinking of, Thanksgiving dinner or like pie or cake and not sweetened condensed milk, but the heart wants what it wants.
I've never eaten a can of sweetened condensed milk. It does sound kind of good to just...
I can see the appeal. I think that a can of sweetened condensed milk would probably be disgusting after like 5 bites, but those 5 bites would probably be really good.
So after this point, it kind of becomes settles into more of a routine here. They're able to rescue the others at the main camp later that morning. They make one final check of Herald Island from the deck of the King and Wing. Same results as every other time they have looked at Herald Island. There's nothing there. No one has made it to the island. There's no clue whatsoever.
Yeah, there's nothing that they can see at Herald Island.
So King and Wing, they actually come across the Bear at sea. And at this point, all of these survivors are transferred over to the Bear with Bartlett, and they return to Nome.
And this is something that McKinley writes about in his diary just so beautifully, his reunion with Bartlett. Because remember, he and Bartlett were, very, very good friends at this point. And he had often written about how he just wants to see Bartlett again. And of course, one of Mayman's final words was, I hope I'll see Bartlett again. They were so close to the captain. And, tragically, Mayman would not be reunited with him, but McKinley was. And so he wrote in his diary just about the joy of finally being reunited with his captain, that, he'd hoped and prayed for this moment for so long, and it was here.
Yeah, McKinley's letters, I know some excerpts are included in both of those books, and he has a very heartfelt bit of writing here that I wanted to include. So from one of his letters home, McKinley writes,
I do not know how or where to begin. Indeed, I know nothing just now. My mind is so full and active that the result of its working is precisely the same as if it were empty. I am not going to tell you my story now, for if you could only get scraps of it, and that would spoil things when I get home.
You see, I wish to have you all sit round me with staring eyes and mouths like to devour me, listening to my tale, how we lived, the feeds we had, and, more tragic, those we did not have, the escapes I had, and so on and so forth. I tell you, it's a tale in a million. The one thing I wish this letter to do for me is to show you I am alive, and how much I am alive.
And just a really cool tidbit that I wanted to point out. This rescue happened on September 7th of 1914, and we are recording this on September 7th of 2025. This is the 111th anniversary of the rescue of the Karluk survivors from Wrangel Island. So just a really cool thing that it worked out that way.
This is perfect and legitimately not planned at all. We've done that a couple times with episodes where it has accidentally worked out that way. This was not the plan, but sometimes things work out.
It's destiny.
So yes, happy anniversary to the long dead survivors of the Karluk.
Well, not all of them are that long dead, but we'll get to that.
Yes, we'll get into that. I mean, that sort of wraps up the story of Karluk herself, the people who were on board her, the people who survived her sinking, survived this amazing Arctic saga of survival on Wrangel Island. Obviously, this still leaves a lot of open threads on the story. So I was curious, you mentioned a little bit of it. So Stefansson goes back out with this northern party. He's just kind of very briefly back in touch, and he heads right back out. And we've focused a lot on the negatives, the failures of Stefansson's northern expedition. Did he end up getting anything out of his 2.0 version of this?
He did. He got some results. He did do some studies, and he did some anthropological work. When he went up with this reformed Northern Party, there's a name that I want to throw out there, and that is a guy by the name of Lorne Knight, who we will hear more about in the bonus episode about the Wrangel Island expedition, was one of the guys that Stefansson took up with him in the reformed Northern Party. They did achieve their goals to an extent. I mean, they did the studying and the field work that they wanted to do. Steph ends up getting very sick. I think it's maybe typhoid fever. I would have to double check and see what exactly he was sick with, but he was very ill for a long time. But then people thought, well, that's the last we'll hear from him, but he got better. So he does not come back down from the Arctic until 1918. He manages to ride out the entirety of World War I in the Arctic, which is deeply unsurprising with everything we know about Steph's character, because World War I is going to have a major effect on the majority of these guys. The Southern Party, the part of the expedition that had been most successful and achieved most of their goals, when the war really started to pick up in 1916, they went home early. So the Southern Party left the Arctic in 1916, and several of those men enlisted in the war effort. Steph was not about to do that. He was not getting involved in the war. So he just stays right up north until 1918. Hilariously enough, there is a story that he was coming back down to the Arctic, and he wanted to do a talk, I think it was in Toronto, about his time in the Arctic and all of the things that he learned about the Copper Inuit, et cetera, et cetera. And he scheduled it for 11/11, like the original Armistice Day, like the main one after the war ended, and then was offended that not enough people came to his lecture. So, like on Armistice Day, on the day that the war ends, this terrible war that killed millions of people, no, he wanted people to come hear him talk instead of celebrating the end of the war. So that kind of checks out too. So that kind of ties up what the Northern Party was up to and what the Southern Party achieved. And the Southern Party, again, they were led by Dr. Anderson, a real scientist, and they had real anthropologists and very committed scientists that were a part of this expedition. And they came home and they published a multi-volume set of all of their findings. So you can still read a lot of their findings online if you're interested. Diamond Jenness's journal from this time was published. we have a lot of information about what the Southern Party eventually got up to and all of the things that they accomplished and everything that they learned about the indigenous peoples of the Arctic at this time. So we've got a lot of good data from them.
Something I forgot to add here, I was going to bring up for the loss aspect of this show. So we've focused, of course, a lot about the people who are on the Karluk, but these aren't actually the only people who die as part of the Canadian Arctic expedition.
Mm-hmm.
Forgot to note down which ones were which, but there were some men lost on either the Southern or Stefansson's second Northern expedition, correct?
Yes.
I noticed this when I was looking at the names on the plaque, and there was several that I was like, I don't know who this person is at all.
Yeah, there were.
I don't have them noted down, but just a note that yes, this was the real disaster one. But even the parts of this that were more or less, successful, this was still a dangerous thing to be doing.
Yeah, and you'll see this even with the quote-unquote successful polar exploration or polar expeditions. A lot of times, just because, like we talked about earlier, every choice that you make is so loaded. There are so many opportunities for something to go wrong. Even the expeditions that are considered the good ones, where, most everybody comes out okay. There'll be a guy who maybe slips on his skis and goes down a crevasse. There are always cases of somebody, maybe getting sick or having some kind of medical issue that they couldn't have anticipated. And unfortunately, there are cases of people dying even on the more successful, less tragic expeditions. But it's the scale of the death that I think is what sets the Karluk apart. Obviously, we did not expect that half of the crew was going to die. You anticipate that there may be a couple casualties if things don't go well, but you don't anticipate that, this massive chunk of the crew is going to perish.
I think also probably from something of a moral victory perspective, it's probably a bit easier to stomach the loss of expedition members when they're at least doing it in the service of the thing that they're there for.
Yeah. And when you have a chance to properly mourn them and everybody can come together and grieve this one person who died of something tragic or who was lost in the service of the expedition.
Yeah, I think it's easier to rationalize that compared to, these people who are starving to death on an island they're not even supposed to be on.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get into this, I need to bring this up so I don't forget. I might drop it back where it goes or just leave it here. In the process of doing this, I was reading about the Russian town of Anadyr, way extreme northeastern Siberia. And in doing so, I came across the flag of Anadyr, and it's probably the coolest flag I've ever seen. It is a bear. I don't know if it's supposed to be a polar bear. It is a bear standing against a sky blue background, standing on what appears to be like snow, and he is holding this enormous fish in his claws, and this bear looks so incredibly happy. He's the happiest looking bear. And then you have this poor little fish that's just I got.
I just pulled it up on your Twitter. That is such a great flag.
It's the coolest flag. I love it. I have no connection to it, but I want that flag hanging in my office. And then people would have to ask oh, is that where you're from? And I would have to be no, it's the coolest flag.
And then you will have an opportunity to force them to listen to you talk about the Karluk, which is a thing that I have figured out how to do. Trying to come up with situations to force my friends and loved ones to listen to me talk about this expedition. So it's a good starting point.
I had a realization the other day. A lot of people make a big deal about not liking to hear themselves recorded, hearing their voice played back to them. I maybe felt that way at the beginning of the podcast, but I had the realization the other day that weirdly enough, one of the things that if I just need to sit down and get motivation to make notes or to do an episode, one of the weird things that motivates me is listening back to episodes of our own podcast that I think were particularly good, because it reminds me hey, you can do this. You made this good episode. You can make another good episode. It sounds incredibly self-centered, but yes, I do love listening back to myself talk about these things.
That is very funny because when we first started this, on the first episode, I think we talked about it and I said, oh, it's really weird listening to myself. But before we recorded every subsequent episode, I have listened to the previous episode at least once, sometimes like, 2 or 3 times, just to see if there was anything I missed, see if there's anything I want to talk about a little bit differently, make sure that I get all the important stuff in. And the more that I do it, the more that I kind of like it and have adjusted to it. So, and I realize that sounds very self-centered, but I have enjoyed listening to myself talk. Usually I just like inflicting the talking on other people, but now I can inflict my own voice back on myself. And yeah, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. It's kind of satisfying.
Okay, so we talked about the other parties. So yeah, let's get to these survivors who make it through this whole saga. What next? After such a life-changing experience, what do you do after that?
So I'm going to start with the guys that we know less about, just to kind of work our way up to the guys that we know the most about. So the guys that we know the least about. So somebody, for example, like John Monroe. John Monroe corresponded with McKinley a couple of times. I think he wrote to Steph once asking for a recommendation for something. He had served in the Navy, I believe. Let me double check myself so I don't say something wrong.
Based on what we said about Monroe as a guy who preferred the company of engines to people, I guess it makes sense that he would kind of just want to drift off.
The last that he had corresponded with McKinley a couple times after they got back, and the last that anybody really heard of him was that he'd married and settled in California. So we don't know a whole lot about him. We do not know a whole lot about Templeman, and that's because Templeman just sort of disappeared off the face of the earth. But before he did that, he did something very, very cool. Do you remember all the way back in the first episode where we talked about the rights to the journals and who would have the rights to the journals?
Yes.
Well, Templeman had been in that tent with Bjarne Mayman when he died. And Templeman took possession of Mayman's diary. And instead of turning it over to the Canadian government as he was supposed to, on his way back home, he snuck all the way up to Norway, delivered Mayman's diary to his family to get around Steph's mandate that everything had to go to the government. And then Templeman just goes to Australia and is never heard from again. And I hope that he was able to start his life over, and I wish nothing but the best for him. But nobody has really been able to track down what he's been up to. And by that, I mean, I have not been able to track down what he's up to. And I feel like my research skills are pretty good as a professional librarian. So if I can't find it, I'm sure somebody out there knows what happened to him, but it's certainly not anything that's just out there in the open. So those are 2 of our guys.
I think it's good for both of them. They had this horrible experience in the Arctic. I'm glad that they both moved places that are a bit more temperate. You got California and Australia, places you can have a nice warm day at the beach.
Yeah. Not in the cold wasteland.
Yeah.
I hope that they both had good lives, since we don't really know what happened to them. So then we've got some of the guys that were in the war. So Williamson. Williamson, he had, dealt with kind of the accusations that Hadley had made about him possibly murdering Bretty. That kind of haunted him for the rest of his life. But he did serve in the Navy. He served in the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy in World War I and World War II. He lived for a really, really long time. He did not die until 1975, and he died in Victoria, Canada. So he didn't really talk much publicly about the expedition. And I don't know if that was just because he was haunted by it or because of the accusations that he'd faced. But he did not really speak about it a whole lot. It's not, some of these guys, we have just tons and tons of writing about them, and we don't have that for Williamson.
That's interesting, because in the very first, the very first segment of this series, we were talking about the appeal of these polar stories, and you had said, these guys were the astronauts of their day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's an interesting conjunction of history to see that some of these guys live into the 70s. Some of these guys live to see us on the moon, in space. So it is a weird sort of, I don't know, a window on like how how close and yet how far away these people seem in history.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that, some of these guys were alive and saw Star Wars. Some of them were alive and, saw us land on the moon. And it's very cool to think about. But somebody like Williamson, I think, he doesn't strike me as the type of guy who would kind of enjoy that kind of rock star status that it might get if you were known that you were, a survivor of a big polar expedition. A lot of these guys went on to do like the speaking circuits and the lecture circuits and talk very openly about their experiences. And either because, maybe he was either not happy about the way he was portrayed, or possibly there was sort of a crisis of morality and was ashamed of his behavior. I don't know. But regardless of what happened, he did not really speak all that much about his experiences.
I guess that's one way to feel a bit better with the ones that we don't really know what happened, your Monroes, Templeman's, because, if they had wanted fame and attention, they probably could have had it. And the fact
absolutely.
The fact that we don't know what happened to them probably is an indicator that, well, that's probably how they wanted it.
Yeah, that and especially Templeman. I think that whatever happened to him changed his life very dramatically. And I don't think that he would ever be seeking out fame or fortune based on his experiences on the Karluk, at least. So we have Williamson, who did live a long life and who did serve in the war, but didn't really talk about it that much. Then we go on to Ernest Chafe, who also served in the war. He was a Newfoundlander, just like Bartlett. And so he served in the war in a Newfoundland regiment. And he suffered, I want to say it was a foot injury, and he was hospitalized for quite a while. But he did enjoy a little bit of the limelight. So he wrote a few articles, and he also had asked for Stefansson's help to kind of get back out on the lecture circuit. So he was somebody who, he was very young when all of this happened too. So I think, if anybody is going to enjoy the attention, it's most likely going to be the younger guys as opposed to the guys who were either older or more deeply traumatized. Chafe certainly didn't have a good time, but he didn't have the worst time. Some of these guys had a much worse time.
Chafe is one that kind of I kind of forget he's there. Like he comes up occasionally, and then he'll sort of drift into the background. And
he was, certainly had a lot of interesting stories to tell and stuff, but he was not somebody who was at the core of the narrative for most of it. So yeah, he wanted to possibly get out on the lecture circuit. He wrote kind of his own some journal articles, some of his own recollections of what had happened, some of which appeared to be possibly plagiarized from things that Fred Maurer had also written, but whatever. So that was Chafe. And Chafe also lived a pretty long life, and he passed away then back in Canada. I don't remember the exact year that he died, but he lived also a fairly long life. So a lot of these guys are living a lot longer than maybe you would expect that they would. Okay, so let's go to Clam. So Clam Williams returned to Wales. He was, of course, a Welsh sailor, and he did make it back to Wales. He'd been hospitalized shortly after the rescue, just because of the injuries on his foot. They did need to take off some more tissue on his foot after that toe amputation. Amazingly enough, an amputation with tin shears and unsanitary conditions did not completely do the job, and they needed to neaten that up a little bit. So he did get his frostbitten foot operated on a little bit, and he also served in the war, as many of them did. He was a sailor in the war. His ship was torpedoed, but he survived, so he's a pretty tough cookie. He goes home to his native Wales, he marries, and he has 3 children, and he died in 1937, so not quite as long-lived as some of these guys, but certainly he crammed a lot of life into the years that he had. What do we have left? We have McKinley, and we have Maurer, or we have Hadley. Oh, Hadley. So Hadley actually does not live very long after the rescue of the Karluk. He dies of the Spanish flu in 1918. But during the time after the rescue, there was that whole controversy with his diary. Was it really his diary, or was it something that Steph had just said was his diary to include it in, I believe, the Friendly Arctic? So Hadley does not have a whole lot happening after the Karluk rescue, but he certainly did end up playing a much more significant role in that than he ever imagined when he boarded that ship as a passenger, just hoping to get from one place to another. So he went on quite an adventure. He did travel a little bit. Hilariously enough, even though we kind of remember Hadley as the racist guy, he traveled with Karluk and his family after they returned for a little bit. He died in 1918 during the Spanish flu. Yeah, and it was the Friendly Arctic where Steph printed the apparently doctored narrative of Hadley's journal.
Probably on the top 3 podium of I'm not even supposed to be here.
Yeah, he doesn't even go here.
The amount to which he suddenly becomes important is pretty impressive.
So then we have Karluk's family. So Karluk and Kiruk and their kids, Helen and Mugpee. So I don't believe we know a whole lot about Karluk and Kiruk. Apparently they did travel with Hadley for a while. So they stayed in Alaska. I know that Helen trained to become a nurse and was either a nurse or a nursing assistant, but she stayed in Alaska, and she ran into some of the other kind of famous polar names from this time. I want to say like Knut Rasmussen or some of the other like famous polar names that you know of. I believe that they kind of passed through the hospital where she was working. She unfortunately died quite young. I don't remember if it was Spanish flu or typhoid fever or exactly which disease it was, but she died fairly young. But Mugpee actually lived until 2008, which is kind of unbelievable that you could start your life off in such a just horrific nightmare situation and then make it as long as she did. So she was going strong for a really long time.
Did Mugpee leave any sort of like long form account, or did she talk about that experience at all from what she remembered?
I believe she talked to family, and she would talk to, people if they asked her, but she did not write anything that we're aware of. She didn't have a diary or, anything that, well, I mean, she was 4, she wouldn't have written a diary, but she didn't have anything that she wrote later in life either, to the best of our knowledge. Of course, I can't say for sure what she might be doing, what she might have done for her family. It's possible that she wrote something down, but yeah, she lives in Point Barrow, Alaska up until 2008. She did still, in the Ice Master, Niven writes about how as of the writing of that book in 2000, she was still able to recall the events and that her memory was clear, and that she also still had a scar on her chin from the day that the cat scratched her.
Yeah, I know all about those. Sometimes those just like don't go away.
Yeah, I've got a few of those myself. So
I think that's such an appropriate little like bit of the story of the cat literally leaving an imprint on the physical bodies of the people who are here.
So I think we're down to just McKinley and Maurer, and I'm going to do McKinley first because I want to tie Maurer into our upcoming bonus episode.
Unfortunately, we see him again.
Fred Maurer did not return home and live a long and happy and quiet life. Alas.
One of the biggest, like, bro, what are you doing moments I've had when I was reading something.
I have a unified theory of Fred Maurer that I'll get into for our bonus episode, but I don't know, man. But McKinley did go home, and he did have a long life. So McKinley, as soon as he was also very ill when they were rescued. So he was hospitalized for a while. And when he got out of the hospital, he went home, he recovered, and then immediately went over to fight in World War I and was shipped off to the trenches. And there's this fascinating quote from McKinley. Let me see if it's reprinted in the Ice Master. Basically,
while you're looking for that, I think McKinley's interesting here in that some of the other ones who do serve in the war, they serve in the Navy. Not to say that the Navy is, getting out of it. Obviously, there's risks there as well. But like McKinley goes to World War One, like from the pictures.
Yeah, like the Western Front.
Yeah.
Yeah, he is not on a ship. He is not in a submarine. He is on the Western Front. I'm going to have to Google for that McKinley quote because it is so good. Okay. Not all the horrors of the Western Front, nor the rubble of Arras, nor the hell of Ypres, nor all the mud of Flanders leading to Passchendaele could blot out the memories of that year in the Arctic. The loyalty, the comradeship, the esprit de corps of my fellow officers and of the men it was my privilege to command enabled us to survive the horrors of the war. And I realized that this was what had been entirely missing up north. It was the lack of real comradeship that had left the scars, not the physical rigors and hazards of the ice pack, nor the deprivations on Wrangel Island. The war was better than Wrangel Island. World War I was better than Wrangel Island.
Like in a way, it would kind of be annoying to be, you know, a trench mate of his, because like nothing that happens is gonna be as he's like, oh, you're cold, are you?
Yeah, you want to hear about cold? Oh, your feet are sore. Oh, okay.
Oh, your feet hurt. Okay.
So McKinley went on to have a very long life also. He returned home after the war. He was injured in the war, but he survived the war. He comes back home and he marries and he settles down in Scotland and resumes his career as a teacher. So he goes back to being a teacher and he spends the rest of his life as a teacher. He had a very long life. He had, I believe, 2 children. And he was so haunted by the events of Wrangel Island that he spent his entire life like kind of obsessing about it and fixating on it. But it wasn't until he was in his 70s, in the 1970s, that he decided that he wanted to write it all down and get it out of his system. So he does go on to write his book, The Last Voyage of the Karluk. And this is when he is revising his journal. So he did keep, and he had the original journal that he kept during his actual time on Wrangel Island. Then he wrote, I want to say, a slightly revised version of that a couple years later. But then in the 1970s, he wrote what he called kind of a revised and amplified version of his journal. And this is possibly where he maybe slips in some stuff that makes himself and Bartlett look a little less guilty of things and maybe made the situations look a little bit different. But he was revising his journal at the same time that he was writing this book. So finally, in the 1970s, just a couple years before he dies, he publishes this book and finally goes out and does TV interviews and talks about it publicly. He hadn't really talked about it that much before then, but he talked about it very publicly. We have a lot of documentaries and footage of him talking about the expedition. Like, that's how we know how to pronounce Karluk, because that's how he pronounced it in the TV interviews that he gave. So we have all of this information coming out of McKinley kind of during the last few years of his life, and we didn't have a whole lot before then. But McKinley survives. He dies in May of 1983. So he died just a few months before I was born. So we almost overlapped, but not quite. But so he had a very long life. I hesitate to say a long and happy life because I know that he did struggle with depression and he struggled with all of the trauma that he experienced. And, you know, what do you do with that? How do you unpack it? I don't imagine that there were a lot of really great mental health options at the time that he was living for figuring out what to do with your trauma. So he did struggle with a lot of demons, but ultimately I think he did the best with what he had. And he, I think, ended up having a very good life, even if it wasn't the life that he originally envisioned.
I feel like I remember seeing the detail also that I think his brother or brothers had also fought in the war. And I think one of his brothers was killed.
One of his brothers was killed, yes. His younger brother, I think it was his younger brother, his brother John, died in the war.
That sort of like harsh reintroduction to your family life, the real world, and then suddenly you're losing family members again. Yeah. Like now that you're like back to safety per se.
Definitely not back to safety in the way that he dreamed of on Wrangel Island, I'm sure. And so that brings us to our last guy, and that is Fred Maurer. And we are going to talk much more about Fred Maurer whenever we talk about our bonus episode that'll be coming up whenever we record that. But Fred Maurer does a couple of interesting things. He is, of course, wounded. His feet are in bad shape, as most of their feet are in bad shape. So whenever he gets home, he gets back to New Philadelphia, he brings the cat. He brings Nikki the cat home with him. So Nikki the cat lived with Fred, and Nikki the cat stayed with him and his family in New Philadelphia. So shortly after he gets home, of course, America does not get involved in World War I right away. The Maurers were a very prominent German-American family in this part of Ohio. And if you know anything about what America was like around the start of World War I, there was a very strong anti-German sentiment in this part of Ohio and in this part of the country, really, sort of to a lesser extent than the way that we treated Japanese Americans during World War II. But there was definitely some of that prejudice. And even though he had injuries still from the Arctic, and even though on his draft card he had claimed an exemption from the draft based on injuries he suffered in the Arctic, whenever we declared war and things were heating up, he immediately started looking for a place to let him enlist. And a lot of places wouldn't let him enlist because his injuries were fairly extensive. But I don't know if it was because of the pressure because he was a German American and he didn't want to be seen as disloyal, or if it was just something that he felt very strongly that he had to do. Eventually, he convinces the Marine Corps Reserves to allow him to enlist, but they won't send him overseas. So instead of being able to be a part of the big show, he is kept in mostly, I think, South Carolina, and he is a first sergeant. And so he is training the guys who are going to go overseas. So he does have this military service. He gets a job at Goodyear, which is a very kind of famous company in this part of Ohio, famous rubber company, famous tire company. He's working at Goodyear, and he is just deeply unhappy. He wants to get back to the Arctic, and he wants to, I don't know if it's trying to reconcile in his own mind what happened or trying to heal something that broke in him while he was up there. I'm not entirely sure, but he starts kind of planning to get back to the Arctic. So he opens up correspondence with Stefansson, and he works with Stefansson to become a part of the lecture tour. There was this lecture circuit called the Chautauqua lectures that were very popular during this time period. They would travel to some of these kind of smaller, more rural areas and bring like cultural lectures with them. So they'd have speakers, they'd have performers and dancers and singers, and just a lot of different like cultural activities that would be in sort of like a traveling circus format that would go around and visit all of these different places. So he was on the Chautauqua lecture circuit talking about his time on the Karluk. And so that he when he did that, he was reconnected with Stefansson because for a while there, he was actually serving as sort of the backup to Stefansson. He would be the opener, and then Stefansson would come on with the big show talking about his experiences. So while he's with Stefansson, he starts to want to go back north again and starts to ask Stefansson, are you planning to go back north? Is there anything that I can do to be considered for a future expedition? Because that's how he got on the first expedition. That's how he got on the Karluk. He was serving on the whaler Belvedere, and he met Stefansson, I think at Herschel Island, and was so impressed by him and all of his great stories that he then wrote him and said, hey, you remember me? We met on Herschel Island. If you're going north, take me with you. So that's how he got on the Karluk. Well, he kind of did that again. So, are you planning to go north again?
This is the point where to Stefansson, this is the get a job, stay away from her meme.
Yeah. This, please go anywhere else. Leave him alone. But Stefansson did not leave him alone. And so he does get himself roped into Stefansson's next venture, which we will talk about in our bonus episode on the Wrangel Island expedition.
Yeah.
Oh, and I don't know if you want to drop this in from earlier, but I wanted to touch on Burt McConnell because I did mention him quickly. McConnell ends up having a very odd career. He's a journalist, and he also, something about spending time with Stefansson, I think, makes young men lose their minds a little bit, maybe, because he became obsessed with like outdoor survival tactics. And so there's this really funny series of articles in the newspapers about Burt McConnell trying to apply for all the necessary permits that he would need to live as a wild man outside, unassisted, without any without any help from the outside world for an article that he was writing. So that feels like a very Stefansson kind of thing to do. So McConnell has a pretty long career as a journalist, and but there was a part of him, I think, that always yearned for that that rugged outdoorsman kind of lifestyle that Steph provided and introduced him to.
When you see the commercials for, like, you know, the tactical butter knife, tacticals, yes. I feel like they're selling them to Burt McConnell here.
They are absolutely selling them to Burt McConnell. He's got tactical sunglasses. He's got, you know, tactical blanket, tactical diaper bag, all of the above. I have some of the articles that I've pulled from the newspaper about his experience as living as a wild man. And of course, there's some, you know, potentially racist undertones to that as well. But it's very interesting that becoming a Steph supporter and the guys who stood by Steph. Now, a lot of, like, the Southern Party, they wrote against Steph. There are some really interesting articles that you can find where they, you know, complain about him and talk about how, you know, he was, you know, they question his methodology, they question his results and all of that. But then there's guys like Burt McConnell and, you know, to an extent Fred Maurer, who stood by Steph, and something happened to their brains as a result of that, I think.
It is interesting, and I guess it just shows that there are people who will gravitate to anyone, some people, and you don't quite understand why. And it's kind of like in Arrested Development, when it's like, him,
yeah, this guy,
and that's a bit how I feel about Steph. It's like, he's the guy you're devoting your life to. But we will talk plenty more about that also in our part 5/bonus that in the notes is titled Stefansson's Attempt to Colonize Wrangel Island.
Yeah.
So I guess we can get into some of the two of the big names, of course, that survived this are Bartlett and Stefansson. To what extent did they cross paths after this? Did they acknowledge one another? Did they meet after this at all?
They did meet a couple times after this. And they were, I would say, cordial but not friendly. Bartlett wrote nothing good about Stefansson for the rest of his life. There was a lot of simmering tension there. Bartlett really resented Stefansson, and part of that was because Bartlett was actually kind of held liable for the loss of the Karluk, even though it was not really under his orders that happened. So Bartlett took the fall for that, even though nobody really blamed him per se. And there's debate about whether they should blame him or not, but he was ultimately the one who took the fall, and Stefansson had no real repercussions whatsoever. So I think that Bartlett was certainly resentful of that. And also, every time that Stefansson had an opportunity, he would blame Bartlett for everything that went wrong in his writing. So in The Friendly Arctic and in his later book, then The Adventure of Wrangel Island, he blames Bartlett for pretty much every shortcoming of the expedition, and everything that happened, he pretty much pins squarely on Bartlett. So they were not friendly with each other. They did meet up a couple times at, I want to say, the Explorers Club, or one of those places where polar guys would occasionally meet up. And I feel like they weren't beating the hell out of each other, at least. I know there was at least one incident that they had where they exchanged unpleasant words, but I think that generally they kind of avoided each other, which was probably for the best.
Yeah, I remember reading one where Steph sort of comes up and says, "Oh, you didn't want to say hi to me?" And Bartlett says something like, I don't even want to hear I don't even want to hear that you exist. And
yeah. Yeah.
I want nothing to do with you.
No.
Which is probably the grown-up thing for Bartlett to do there. Just walk away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, Bartlett had a lot of his own stuff going on. Bartlett served in the war. Bartlett tried to serve in World War II also. He was a very famous, polar captain at this point, and he was involved in lots of different things. He had his own ship, the FEM Morrissey, and that was his baby, and he loved that ship to death. And so he was constantly up in the Arctic, going back and forth, running missions and doing a little exploring and doing all of those things that really made him happy. Bartlett had also had his own struggles with substances. In his book and everything, he claimed to be a teetotaler, but it's very kind of well known that he did struggle with alcoholism at various points in his life. So he certainly had his own struggles. He never married. He never had children or had a family. So his life was the sea. His life was his ship and being up in the north and going on these expeditions. And he, I think, had a pretty full life by all accounts of doing things that brought him joy. And aside from, of course, the struggles with addiction and the fights with Steph and having to maybe take the fall for things that maybe were not his fault, Bartlett did okay. And he is still today known as one of the greatest ice navigators of all time, and certainly, one of the most prominent polar captains of all time. So you can visit his grave up in Newfoundland, and they have statues to him and plaques to him all over Canada. He is a very well-known figure, even though there were, again, some bumps in the road for him, but he's still a very well-known figure and a very well-respected figure today.
I think you kind of mentioned it in the last bit, but in terms of was there any actual like legal repercussions here? I know you mentioned Bartlett sort of taking the blame. Was there any sort of actual formal findings for that?
Oh, I want to say there was some kind of like inquisition just because the ship went down. And I think that, Bartlett was found like technically liable for that, but it was one of those situations where nobody at the time really blamed him for that. It was just sort of somebody has to take the fall for this, and it may as well be you because you were the captain. In terms of other repercussions, the big thing is this expedition went so unbelievably over budget. They spent so much more money than they were supposed to send. So Canada was not thrilled with this expedition. Canada, as a rule, I think, got tired of Steph's shit before America did. So after the Wrangel Island situation, you'll notice that Steph is actually spending more of his time in the United States than in Canada because Canada had had enough of him by and large. But America, maybe because they weren't as tuned in to the Karluk situation, I'm not sure, but America tend to have a little more patience and tolerance for Steph than Canada did by about the 1930s.
Being a Canadian soldier on the Western Front and, wondering, well, why do we have these, cheap rations and cheap uniforms? It's like, well, the government spent all of its money on an Arctic expedition that didn't go very well. So
yeah.
So they're having to cut some corners.
Yeah. At the word of a guy who is definitely not hiding up in the Arctic dodging the draft. That is definitely not happening.
I will say that, like, props to Steph, though, if you're going to dodge military service, it's like that at least is a way to show you're really committed to it. Like, I'm gonna hide up in the Arctic.
And he legitimately did get very sick. I mean, it's not like he was truly like hiding in a cave or something. He was sick for a part of it, but also that's commitment to the bit. He was very good at committing to the bit. So a little bit about Steph, what ends up happening to him is he also lives a pretty long life. He, for the most part, spends the majority of his life down in the United States instead of Canada after everything goes down with Wrangel Island. He spent a lot of time like contracting with various governments to talk about ideas that he had for the Arctic and things. He wanted to herd reindeer and have a reindeer farm in the Arctic. He was involved in a project about the nutritional makeup of pemmican with, I think, the U.S. Army. He had a lot of different irons in the fire, but eventually he does settle into Dartmouth University, and they still have all of his papers and everything today. But he served as a professor there until he passed away in the 1970s. A note about Steph, too, I mentioned earlier that he had a taste for very young women. He married his wife when he was in his 60s, and she was 28 years old.
Problematic a little bit, but...
Yeah, everybody's a legal adult, and I don't want to, moralize. People can do what they want when they're adults, but also...
Can a 28-year-old woman really decide if marriage is good for her?
So it's... that was a trend throughout his life, but he kind of had a reputation as somebody that women liked. He was sort of a womanizer, had a lot of different relationships with women, but when he didn't officially marry anyone until he married his wife when she was quite a bit younger than him. And she, of course, survived him because she was so much younger than him. But so yeah, Steph's reputation got better, I think, in the United States, and he was sort of regarded as a polar luminary. And he wrote an autobiography, and people thought of him as the guy who invented the keto diet and the guy who was behind all of this cool Arctic science. And I think it's only within the last maybe 40 or 50, at least since his death, that people are starting to look a little bit more critically at him.
And that wife that you were talking about was Stefansson, of course. That's his wife that everyone knows about, not his secret wife.
Yes, not his secret wife, no. Although he did not marry, I think her name is Evelyn, he did not marry her until after Panagabluk had died. So there is something to be said for the idea that maybe Panagabluk was the love of his life, if he could have such a thing. So he did, marry his official wife, his legal wife that he could show people, after his secret wife had already passed. So I guess that's, I don't know, kind of honorable, maybe. I don't know.
Dare I say feminist Steph?
Feminist Steph. He was less virulently misogynistic in some ways, but some of the stuff that he believed about Indigenous women, especially, it was really icky. There's one thing, I don't want to get too into it because it's gross, but also he wrote in The Friendly Arctic that he believed that Indigenous women were ready for marriage and children at a younger age than white women. And the reason that happened is because the igloos and the huts that they lived in were kept at a higher temperature than the places where white people usually lived. And so because of being in a warm temperature, they experienced sexual maturity faster and were therefore ready to be mothers at 12, 13, 14. So it was okay that white men were having relationships with 12, 13, 14-year-old Native girls, really. That was an okay thing because they, because of the warmth of their dwellings, they were ready for those types of relationships at a very young age. So, ew.
That explanation should definitely be followed up with the phrase "Your Honor."
Yeah. So yeah, it's sort of a content warning for gross stuff with young girls, but that is that, and it wasn't just Steph that believed this. Unfortunately, that was not an uncommon view, but his reasoning having to do with the warmth of their dwellings is just so bizarre.
Let's see how that one flies in court. So, we have sort of concluded that bit of it. There is, of course, more to talk about with Stefansson in our bonus. In the bonus, I also do want to talk a bit about his writings, specifically The Friendly Arctic.
Yeah.
And so we can get into that, and we can get into Stefansson's next attempt at glory with the attempted colonization of Wrangel Island, a place that I think after reading all of this and talking about all this, Wrangel Island seems like a wonderful place to try to put more people to survive.
I mean, just move your family up there. It's great. It's perfect. There's nothing wrong with living on Wrangel Island. There's
a bunch of birds, there's bears, there's everything you could ever need. Really?
There's whale bones. Lots of whale bones on Wrangel Island. Also mammoth bones. Apparently, Wrangel Island was supposed to be sort of the last stand of the woolly mammoth, that the last place on Earth that woolly mammoths could be found before they died out. So lots of mammoth bones up there, too. It's perfect place to live.
Mammoth bones, Maimon bones.
Malik bones.
Everything you could want. So yeah, with that, I mean, this is sort of our final wrap-up segment. I don't know. It's a lot of stuff we went through. Obviously, there's way more stuff that people can dig into. If this is an interesting story, you are probably one of the best people they could talk to about if they want to dig deeper and read more.
Yeah, I'm on social media as Jess Loves Boats. Feel free to send me a message on any of the platforms. I am happy to hook you up with some recommended sources. And also, just over the years of being obsessed with the story, I have acquired a decent little library of like original archival documents that I've gotten scans of from the archives that host them that I'm not sure if I'm legally allowed to share those, but I probably will if you ask nicely.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, thank you for joining us on this. This would have been a lot of stuff to get through, I think, if it was just Taylor and I going in cold.
And thank you for having me. This has been so much fun. I am having the best time, and I really appreciate you guys allowing me to get on here and talk about my favorite topic, and also like historiography and so many of the intricacies of it that I never dreamed I'd be able to talk about on a podcast. So thank you guys.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this has been great. Yeah, final thoughts for me, sort of wrapping up. This was one that I did not know a lot about going into. So I knew it was going to be a lot of new stuff. And yeah, I think this is a good entry point into Arctic and Antarctic, the polar exploration, because there are two good, book length accounts of it that can get you sort of acclimated. And then, as we said, there's so much more you can read. There's the firsthand accounts. There's all kinds of stuff. There's plenty of academic journal writing about this as well. We've included some of those in the sources. Might just compile like a little, I don't know, further reading list that we can include in the notes. But yeah, this is kind of the end of the Karluk story. Again, not the end of Stefansson's story. We will be back very soon with that bonus episode for you. If you're a patron on Patreon at either level, so if you're a second mate or an Able C person, you'll get access to the bonus to sort of put a nice little bow on this tale. So thank you again, Jess. And we will talk to you all soon. Until then, take care.